Good evening and welcome to a special Q&A focused on people living with disability. I'm Tony Jones, here to answer your questions. Former Discrimination Commissioner Graeme Innes, parent and carer Catia Malaquias, wheelchair, basketball and tennis champion and broadcaster Dylan Alcott, acclaimed actress and disability advocate Kiruna Stamell, and the founding father of the NDIS, now director of the Melbourne Disability Institute, Bruce Bonyhady. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. We also have two Australian sign language interpreters in the Q&A studio for Auslan speakers. Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio. Well, about half of the people in tonight's audience have identified themselves as people living with disability or carers, and they've got lots of questions. Let's get started with our very first one. It's from Steph Travers.
Hi, my question's for Dylan. Hi, everyone. Dylan, you've stated that you wish to make disability sexy again. I'm a part-time wheelchair user, and the difference between when I'm standing on my crutches to when I'm sitting in the chair is staggering. Sometimes I'm often talked down to like a child, patted on the head, or ignored completely. I've even had friends in a chair being offered money out of pity. We can't all be elite sportsmen, so how do we actually go about creating a campaign of true inclusion and full awareness to change attitudes against all people with a disability?
Yeah, Steph, thanks so much for the question. Thanks everyone for being here tonight as well. It's such an awesome room to get to talk about disability. It's something that I'm really passionate about because before I was a Paralympian and on radio, you know, I'm just a person with a disability as well. And when I was growing up, I really struggled about the fact that I had a disability. I was really embarrassed about the fact that I had a disability. It was rough and tough, like leather for me. Like I struggled to be comfortable with who I was. And I really wanted to try and change the way that people view people with a disability. You know, people think we are broken, less capable, unemployable, undateable, can't have sex, don't travel, don't do the things that an able-bodied person does. And, you know, we need more positive role models in mainstream media, breaking down those stigmas and those barriers for people. And, you know, I used to really struggle as a kid because when I turned on the TV, I used to ask my mum and dad, same as the radio, same as the newspaper, why don't I see anybody like me? I don't know anybody like me. And whenever I did, it was a road safety ad of someone drink driving, they have a car accident. The next shot is someone like me who thinks their life's over. Or whenever you watch a movie, I don't know if you've seen a movie called You Before Me, it's this movie about this, he's an able-bodied guy, he's a sexy guy, he's a hot guy. He's a billionaire, he's loaded, and then he has an accident, ends up in a wheelchair. So now he is a sexy guy. He's still sexy, he's in a wheelchair though, he's loaded, and Khaleesi of Game of Thrones wants to have sex with him. And what does he do? He kills himself because he's in a wheelchair. What does that tell the public about my life and who I am? And I think it's really important throughout all mainstream media, you know, broadcasting, advertisements, things like that, that we change the way that we view people with a disability in a positive light, not even talking about their disability, just showing us as normal people who contribute to society. And I was lucky enough to be in a campaign for ANZ where they didn't mention I was in a wheelchair. They were just a proud supporter of me and the things that I did. And that broke down a lot of barriers. And I know, Steph, it annoys me that people are like, oh yeah, you know, you're the Paralympian, and I want that to permeate down to more people, because a natural part of life is going on a date, having friends, you know, that connection that people with disability miss out on, and it, you know, makes me emotional that people don't get that. And I think it's important that people in powerful positions include in our workplaces, in our advertisements, everywhere, people with disability, so we don't have a Q&A special about disability. It's just normal. It's a normal part of life.
That was an uninterruptible answer, if I may say so. You very rarely get them. Kiruna.
I just want to... That was very good. I just want to add to that because as a woman growing up in the 80s, I remember, well, to start with, you can think of representations of people with dwarfism. So, you know, I was devastated often when I saw a little person on television because what I saw was somebody that was being ridiculed. They were other, they were often not human, they were often doing something really debased and embarrassing. And I remember just being an ordinary little girl watching that going, oh, is anybody ever going to love me? Like, is it weird? Am I weird? Should I be jumping out of photocopiers and scaring people? Is that what people like me do? Like, is that the truth? And what I've realised is it's not even just about positive examples. It's actually about truthful examples. You know, it's about the honest thing. Like, as an actor, it drives me absolutely bananas. I am more likely to be somebody's wife, teacher, lawyer, secretary, woman behind the counter than I ever am to play one on screen or on stage. Like, that's actually just being dishonest. Like, the world is not this body fascist utopia where everyone is a super hottie. And the one example I remember thinking, which was Dirty Dancing, where Baby had a slightly wonky nose. As soon as she made that movie, she had a nose job. And that was devastating for me. So that, you know, I mean, my examples weren't even of disabled women. They were of not even seeing a woman that was even just slightly less attractive, you know? So I think that those things are so important. And I know a lot of the discrimination I meet on the street directly correlates with what's happening in the press and in terms of media. Like, so, you know, Austin Powers comes out, and for the next 5 years, my sisters and I hear Mini-Me when we're walking down the street. So I see a very strong link and a very strong correlation. I am not for censorship, but I'm very much for actually truthful representation and showing people actually being people living lives that we're actually living, you know? I just want to play characters which are truthful for somebody like me, not what society thinks somebody like me should be doing, which is living under a toadstool and working for Santa. That's not real.
I think we can tell that. Yeah, Graeme, go ahead.
One of the reasons that I started the Attitude Foundation with a group of other people when I left the Human Rights Commission 4 years ago was that I learned from my own experience that changing attitudes changes lives. I spent 12 months trying to get a job as a lawyer who couldn't see, not able to convince people that I could function as a lawyer, and I changed the attitude of one man at the Department of Consumer Affairs who gave me a job as a clerk in legal, and that changed my life. And I've seen again and again at my time as Commissioner that changing attitudes changes lives. And so we just need to what I describe as remove the soft bigotry of low expectations, because if you set the bar low, that's as far as most people will go. And that really hurts us as people with disabilities. We have to convince the community that we can do life, we can do work, we can do community activities. And just to come back, Dylan, to your point about that hot guy in the movie, I bet he wasn't played by a person with a disability. I bet he was played by someone else. So we don't even get the chance to play ourselves.
They asked me, I was busy, unfortunately. No, he was played by an able-bodied person,
yeah.
and that's the point that you make. And going back to you, Steph, disability doesn't have to be 1970s Zimmer frame, dusty,
no.
like everybody thinks that it is. You know, there are young people, old people, people just getting out there living their lives, and I think if we can break that perception that it is that dusty, old, part of diversity, it will really have a big effect, and hopefully everybody can get out there and live those lives they want to live.
Can I add a practical element to this?
You can if you're brief.
I'll be really quick, I promise. It's not just attitude, but it's also attitude to remove physical barriers.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So you've got to think that a physical barrier, like a set of stairs, the decision to put stairs in rather than lift or not provide a ramp is actually also an attitude. But there's a physical reality and manifestation of that attitude in the real world. So we've got to remember that as well, because it isn't just, I'm going to be really positive and not see their disability and treat them. You know, I need to make sure that I'm removing physical and ideological obstacles.
Yep.
Guys, let's move on, because we've got quite a lot of questions to get through, and I'm being urged from upstairs to get through as many as we can. The next one's from Amanda Wood.
Bruce, in 2016 you said the NDIS is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for people with a disability. It will make Australia more than the lucky country. I know so many people with disabilities, families and service providers that now see the NDIS as a train wreck waiting to happen, with the poor communication, rushed policies. Families and providers are getting out. Not really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. What do you now think about it and that quote?
Well, I'm still extremely positive about the NDIS, and I just ask you and everyone here and everyone watching tonight to go back to where we were 10 years ago with a system that was inefficient, underfunded, unfair, gave people no choice as to what service they would get. And compare with where we are today, and the difference is that we've now got hope. I understand that for many people, the hopes today are not being realised in the way that we all expected they would be.
Yeah, we've had an avalanche of questions about that, Bruce, and can I just bring you quickly to that point? Train wreck was the phrase there, and it's the fear, I think, that it's headed that way of many people in this room, and I know because of the questions we got. Why? Why that fear? What's happening?
I think there are a series of things, Tony, that have happened, and Amanda, that have happened that contribute to the situation that we're in today. And many of those, in fact, most of those, I think, are outside the control of the NDIA. So we have an IT system that is still not fit for purpose. We all, people tell me daily about their troubles they have accessing that system. Providers tell me about the problems that they are experiencing. This was supposed to be an e-market that would enable people to transact quickly, that would enable providers to claim easily, and we're just so far from that. We also have a system that has been capped in terms of the number of staff that the agency has. And I look at that and I say, why? You know, what purpose is it serving, and how short-sighted is it? So there is...
Bruce, does it, I know this is a key concern of yours, and we should get it out right at the beginning of this program, that the funding has not been put in place. The permanent funding has not been put in place, and there's a fear that it won't be. For example, I heard in the green room, if we have another downturn, the first thing that will be cut will be the future funding for the NDIS.
So we've come some way, Tony, I think, to be fair to our political leaders. So we now have bipartisan support for the scheme, and we have an agreement that the scheme is fully funded. But what we do not have, and what we need to have, is to have that locked in legislation so that when a downturn does come, that funding is secure. And it's not just that funding, but also I've argued for a contingency reserve as well. So there are a series of things that need to happen that will, I think, secure the future of this scheme.
Briefly, is it political will that's lacking?
I think it's political leadership we need. And, you know, in Dan Tehan, I think we've got a Commonwealth Minister who's deeply committed to this scheme. In Jenny Macklin, we have an opposition spokesperson who's also deeply committed to this scheme. There are a series of things that could be done simply tomorrow that would transform the experience of people using the NDIS. And that would include the IT system. It would mean, it would include having sufficient staff. It would include staff training. It includes a focus on a market adjustment that needs to happen. And importantly, we need to make sure that outside the NDIS, those people who do not qualify for an individualised package, that there is support for them.
We're going to come to that in a specific question, Bruce.
Tony, can I just give you some context with numbers? And I think it's really important, and I agree with all the things Bruce has said. We now have 160,000 participants on the scheme. 45,000 of those people have never received disability services before. This is huge social change, and I'm not suggesting that there haven't been problems, because Bruce is right, and Amanda, you're right, there have been. But let's just remember to put it in that context.
Can I just quickly bring Catia in, because we haven't heard from you, and you're here as a carer, because your son Julius has Down syndrome, and it hasn't reached WA yet where you are.
That's right.
But what are the hopes?
Well, I mean, for me, for Julius, we're still about 12 months away, and WA fought really hard for this scheme. I mean, we fought hard as a community during the Every Australian Counts campaign, and we then fought hard when the West Australian government decided to adopt a different scheme, which was called My Way, NWA, NDIS. We are, of course, watching what's happening around Australia, and the problems with the implementation and the issues around delays and the sort of level of skill of planners, so that people are actually getting the supports that they need. And those things are really concerning. But, we fought so hard for this, and this is a scheme that replaces a model that was really broken. And that did not give choice and control to people. And I want my son to have choice and control. I want him to grow up to live a life of his choosing.
Choice and control is going to be a key part of some of the coming questions, so we'll hold that there. Let's go to we'll quickly go to our next questions on the same subject. So it's from Carolyn Frischo.
Hello, panel. I'm the mother and carer of a young woman with Down syndrome, and I work with Down syndrome New South Wales. As a self-managed participant of the NDIS for the past 5 years or so, I have experienced the core principles of person-centred choice and control swiftly degrading under the pressure of the business-first models fiercely adopted by service providers, to the point where participants and their families have been brought to their knees. Did you see this coming, and what do we do about it?
So, Bruce, I'll go back to you and then I'll come back to the other side of the panel, but keep your answers brief if we can.
Yeah. So Carolyn, I think what we saw was that this scheme would take probably 10 years to introduce successfully. There's no... we're introducing not just additional funding, but we're also introducing an insurance approach, and we're introducing control and choice and bringing in a market. And in all of those things, there are a series of change, plus a cultural change. And I think as we look at it, this was always going to take some time. I think the issues that we're talking about, though, could be fixed with the sorts of changes that I indicated earlier. That if we change the IT system, have more staff, recognise the sort of pressures that providers are under and assist them with adjustment, I think we would be in a very different position to where we are today.
Dylan, you want to get in?
Yeah, Carolyn, thanks so much for your question. I think, at the core, I love the idea of the NDIS, so does a lot of people with disability, because it gives that choice, it's supposed to on paper at least. And I think one of the big misconceptions is that a lot of people still think it might be like a welfare system, but it's an investment in people with disability to get what they need so they can become contributing members of our society, so they can pay taxes rather than get benefits. But if they're not receiving those things, it's impossible for them to do so. And I think the lack of funding, especially because we were pretty positive there saying, oh, it's locked in. But if something happens tomorrow, it's gone. I know it's gone. And I think cash rules everything around the NDIS, and these parties are trying to protect themselves, protect their neck, in the sense that they don't want to always stick their neck out, you know what I mean, and put themselves on the line. And it sucks, because if they lose that funding, so many people with disabilities are going to be put on the back foot, go back to where they were from. And I think one of the biggest things with the providers, that in my involvement with my company Get Skilled Access, where we consult a bit with the NDIS, these people don't have much lived experience with disability. These people haven't had much training with disability. I talked to some people that run the call centre out of Melbourne. She's a manager there. She's worked there for 3 years. Guess how much empathy training and disability training she's done? Not a second. And she's begging for it, because people call up and they talk about their disability and she has to Google it to understand. That breaks my heart, because that also not only puts the people with a disability in a bad situation, or their carers on the phone, but imagine these poor people on the phones working at the NDIS going, I'm out of my depth here, because there aren't enough staff and there aren't enough education around it. And even the planners that go out, it always gets on the backlog because they don't know enough about disability themselves. And especially people with non-physical disabilities, they can't advocate for themselves maybe as well as maybe I can. And they might, as a result of that, not get the funding that they need, because they fall through the cracks. And we need more staff and more education around that, so it doesn't happen. And so the providers can give what they should give and not take advantage of these people.
I'm going to so everyone wants to jump in, but I tell you what, believe me, you've got a chance to come back to these issues. The next question's from Marie Jenner. Hello, Marie.
I'll just stand up. Like Kiruna, I'm a person of short stature. I'm 120 centimetres tall. But like Kiruna too, I live in a world that's built for average height people. Therefore, for me to be able to contribute, like you say, I need modifications. I need modifications to my car so I can drive. I need modifications in my home. And I need assistance with some of my daily activities that I'm not able to do independently by myself. So therefore, I should fit and sit, I am a participant, under the classifications of the NDIS. But I'm also involved with the Short-Statured Persons of Australia. And some of the members of the association, people of short stature, that are more disabled than what I am, are shorter than I am, they have been declined access or told they're not disabled enough. What can you advise to improve this so it doesn't happen?
Start with Kiruna.
One of the things that's been identified when I've spoken to a lot of people is a lack of consistency between service provision, planners. Part of that is actually, I believe, because of the employee numbers cap. So you're having to outsource to a lot of external bodies. So trying to get a lot of people under the same umbrella is a challenge. Also, dwarfism I always find is interesting because it's often about our relationship to the built environment, the outside world, but we can bend over, touch our toes, So I actually live between the UK and Australia, so I've got the experience of the English system, where I actually had a huge problem as well because of the way they were defining things like walking.
So do they, when trying to access the system, did they make you go through a series of tests, or how did it work?
Well, I actually, and this is, I think, appalling, I was assessed by somebody who was a qualified midwife. So in terms of her training, I also had another moment where I was trying to get my kitchen modified, and I had one of the people come and assess me. This is in England, not in Australia. In the kitchen, everything was above my head, and I kid you not, she looked at me and she went, "What's the problem?" And I went, "I can't reach anything." And so there's an education element of it as well, because I think often, no offence, Dylan, but you guys get all the publicity because you're on all the toilet doors. So there's an idea of what disability looks like.
That was modelled on me.
So I think that we've got a staffing issue, we've got a training issue. The training issue is also being picked up actually by the ASU, the Australian Services Union. I had a look at their website and it was quite interesting that not necessarily the service providers, but the end service workers are identifying these problems as well as the end service users. So I would like to see more communication, with the men and women who are actually working on the ground alongside the disabled individuals and go, what's your experience?
Kiruna, can I just go back to Marie? You asked a question, you identified that people who are shorter than you, people who have higher levels of, you assess it anyway, as having higher levels of disability, are not able to access the system.
Declined access.
Yeah, why? And have they been told why?
That it didn't. In one case in particular, she was told that her disability didn't impact enough on her daily activities.
That's a joke.
But see, that's training. That is about training. You know the experience, particularly with dwarfism, and I know other disabilities have a similar thing where, I would point at anybody's body and go, what do you know about that person? And a sensible person would go, I don't know. It's their body, I can't know. But the number of people that will look at a disabled person and go, oh, your back's not that bad. Oh, it's not that hard. Oh, stop complaining. So I think it's a training issue and it's a consistency issue, and it is a real problem.
Can I just quickly go, Graeme, I'd just like to hear you on this, because does it blunt your optimism to hear these kind of stories, or is it a 10-year process and we just have to wait till people get the education they need and so on?
I think Bruce is right that it's a 10-year process. I mean, this is a huge piece of national social infrastructure. But I need to clarify a few things, and I don't want to sound like an apologist for the NDIS here, because it's a significant disappointment to me that the agency are not on this panel.
Can I just... Can I make the point? It's an obvious one that we did obviously offer the NDIA a place on the panel, and they declined.
And that is a serious strategic error, and there's no hiding from that. Outcomes are always going to be better with open communication. So, having given the agency a serve, let me now let me now just make a couple of comments. Firstly, I think it's important to note that whilst I agree with you, Dylan, that staff need disability training, 15% of NDIA staff are people with disabilities, and that is higher than any other Commonwealth government department, most of which average around 2.8, 2.9%. That's a shameful employment record for our government, and our government can't sit there and tell private employers to give jobs to people with disability when they're not doing it themselves. 100%. That's the first thing.
Graeme, can I just... very brief question. Is it the fact that there is no one on the NDIA board or management committee who have a disability?
No, I don't think that is the case, but I can't be... well, no, actually, I know it's not the case. I know it's not the case. John's on the board. John Walsh is on the board. So, no, that's not a fact.
All right, so that was an anecdotal piece of non-evidence. Let's go to Catia, who wants to jump in.
Yeah, look, I just wanted to add something here as well. I think in this context, and I'm... Obviously, I mentioned that my son isn't yet in the scheme, but sitting on the board of Down Syndrome Australia, we are getting a lot of feedback from families, and we actually have a survey out at the moment. And one thing that's very important, and so with Down syndrome, it's you need to establish to prove functional impact of disability, so it's not on the list A. Generally speaking, people have had positive experiences, but we have had some people that have been knocked back. And advocacy has been really, really important there. So maintaining the advocacy that needs to occur in relation to the NDIS from state organisations or national organisations is critical to getting this right.
Okay. I'll just make one more point about the NDIA. They did invite anyone who has concerns or feedback about the NDIS to contact them on 1-800-800-110 or by email feedback at ndis.gov.au. Now, I know a lot of people in the audience are laughing, but that is your opportunity.
But Tony, people do laugh, but it is important to remember that the 90% of scheme participants have indicated in surveys that they've completed that they're satisfied with their plans. So I'm not saying there aren't problems out there and problematic stories, but we just need to keep this in balance, because the NDIS, as Bruce has said, was a great hope 4 years ago. I still hold that hope, and we just have to be careful that we don't, in terms of looking at these problems that have existed, and I think Bruce has laid them out, that we don't lose that opportunity, because it's the opportunity of a century for Australians.
Okay, now I'll come back to you, Bruce. Now, we've got another question before we leave the NDIS and move on to other subjects, and then we'll come back to it. We've got a question from Rachel Selnicker.
As a mental health community support worker, since the NDIS was introduced, I've had to tell clients they aren't sick enough. I've had to encourage them to play up the severity of their illness and leave them with absolutely no support because Social Security funding was obliterated. I would like to know what exactly was the plan, or is the plan, for mental illness and NDIS?
Bruce.
Okay. The plan, well, the intention with the NDIS was that it would cover around 68,000 people with persistent complex mental health issues. It was never the plan that funding for mental health that previously went to people who were never going to be eligible for the NDIS would be allocated to the NDIS. What is happening in mental health is an example of what is happening more broadly, which is that the support for people who are not eligible for an individualised package is very weak or non-existent. We're also seeing that in the case of autism. And as a result, what we're seeing is almost unbearable pressure on this scheme. If the last person in this scheme gets a lot more than the first person who misses out, we've got a cliff at the edge of that scheme. And the only alternative for people is to either accept that and then have their disability become much worse and come into the scheme later at much greater cost, which obviously contravenes the insurance principle, or to do exactly what you have said, which is to exaggerate their disability and in the process destroy the culture of this scheme. This scheme is all about opportunity and maximising your capability. And what you're describing is the exact reverse of that.
Let me just go back I'll go back to Rachel because she asked the question, is it your opinion that people with severe mental illness, therefore disability, are somehow being discriminated against?
Oh, definitely. It depends what mental illness you have as to if you're entitled to support or not. I mean, who made up the scale for whether schizophrenia is worse than bipolar? Who made the scale up?
Yeah, so we'll have a short answer to that, Bruce, because we've got a lot to get through. But
So, look, I'd have to come back to that specific question that you've asked, and I'm happy to talk to you after the program to understand the point that you're making, because I was not aware of that particular difference to which you're referring.
OK, we'll allow that to happen later. The next question is from Fiona Bridger, who's using an audio device to ask her question.
I am 35 and have an undergraduate degree in visual arts, a master's degree in art administration and a postgraduate diploma in politics and public policy. I have applied for graduate positions with Commonwealth departments but was unsuccessful. I applied for a graduate position with India. I thought as a disabled person, I might have stood a chance there. I received no feedback at all. I have come to the realisation that I may never get a job. What does the panel consider should be done to encourage employers, agencies and government departments to give physically disabled people a fair go?
I'll start with Dylan and then I'll come to Graeme.
Fiona, thanks so much for your question. That sucks, to be honest. That makes me bloody upset. And I think there is this misconception about people with a disability that we are unemployable, can't do a role as well as somebody else, have a lot of sick days, we're going to miss a lot of time off work, and they're all not true. For example, like Deloitte did a study saying that people with a disability are 90% more likely to be equal to or more productive than an able-bodied person. Telstra commissioned a study over 15 months, said that people with a disability have 8 less sick days off than an able-bodied person. They stay in a role a whole extra year than an able-bodied person. If you take away the fact that they've got a disability, that sounds like a bloody good candidate to me. Yeah. That sounds like an awesome candidate. And I think that's like the cream of the crop. And I know what you mean. Like, I remember when I applied for a job when I was a youngster, I put my name, my email, everything like that. And like the 5th thing I was asked was, do you have a disability? And then like 6 more drop-down menus came up before they even knew anything about me. If I was good for the role, if I could do the job. You know, they had no idea about my style, anything about me at all, really. And what I found was, on that interview, I clicked no, and then I turned up and they said, why didn't you tell us you're in a wheelchair? And I said, if I did, would have I got the interview? No. And they said, of course you would have. And I said, no way would have I got that interview.
Let's go to Graeme. Graeme, Fiona has an undergraduate degree, a master's degree, a postgraduate diploma, and can't get a job. Is there any evidence that she couldn't do a job?
Well, I wouldn't have thought so, Fiona. I wouldn't have thought there was.
Particularly since she applied in the NDIA, for example.
But, I mean, look, I can't... obviously, I wasn't part of the selection process when you applied to the NDIA. But people with a disability employed at a rate 30% lower than the general community. And the question that you ask is, how do we fix this? Well, there's a couple of really key things that we can do. The first thing that we could do would be adopt the scheme that I and a number of advocates recommended to the government 4 to 5 years ago, of giving every member of parliament an extra staffer if they appointed a person with a disability. That's the first thing that we could do. The second thing that we could do is to set some targets in departments to get them from that shameful 2.9% of employees with disabilities up to, I mean, let's go for a third of the people with disabilities of working age. Let's go for 5%. And when you set the targets, you link the meeting of those targets with the bonuses of the secretaries and deputy secretaries of the department. I'm sure that in 2 to 3 years we would see those numbers move very quickly. I mean, there's got to be leadership commitment by government to change the employment situation of people with disabilities. Not talking about it, not running publicity campaigns, actually doing it.
And Catia, I'm just bringing Catia first because she's caught in the middle of two, brilliantly eloquent panellists. But I want to. You've got your son Julius is 9 years old. Yes. How do you feel about his employment future?
Look, I'm so glad that you asked me the question, because I think a really important issue that we need to talk about as well is employment for people with intellectual disability. And Graeme, you mentioned targets, and I know that there are quite a few countries around the world, and Australia is not one of them, where they have entrenched in legislation targets for the employment of disabled people. Now, when it comes to intellectual disability, they haven't made any inroads. So often people with intellectual disability are left out of those as well. And then when I look into the future for my son, and when I look at what's happening now, I mean, we've got the Australia and Disability Enterprises, which are, layman's term, sheltered workshop, but that 75% of people working in those are people with intellectual disability. Yes. Now, they're working in a segregated environment for very, very low wages. They're not fair wages. So I want my son to get employment in the open market, and I really need to see a lot more commitment from governments to change the situation that we have now, so that can actually occur. So I do think that when we're talking about the employment of people with disability, we need to specifically think about the barriers that exist for people with intellectual disability, people with Down syndrome. And I might mention as well, there was a great report that was done by McKinsey & Co. a few years ago that actually looked at the benefits of employing people with Down syndrome. And they look specifically at things like improvements in organisational health for companies. So, I really want to see intellectual disability in that conversation at all levels.
Kiruna.
I just have to applaud Graeme's idea about employment of disabled people in government. I think that would so radically change the culture of Parliament. Like, even that horrible question time where they're yelling at each other, if you had a deaf member of Parliament or somebody that's, visually impaired, they'd all have to be quiet because actually they need to make it accessible. I would love the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition to always be Auslan interpreted. Always, whenever they speak, not just when there's a national emergency. So there's an element of representation, but there's also showing leadership and inviting people to the top table, and that will make a massive idea. And I just want to share a story with you. I got my first acting job, which is what I really wanted to do, because I got discriminated against in a law firm when I was going for a secretarial position to pay my way through university. And it was the first sort of serious job that I'd gone for. A friend already worked there, and she was on their scheme. She was non-disabled. We were at school. Academically, I'd outperformed her, so I had a really strong CV. She saw my CV on her boss's desk, and she said, "Oh, I went to school with Kiruna. I know her. She's really cool." And she mentioned that I had dwarfism. She saw her boss take the CV off the desk and put it in the trash and go, "Well, the lawyers will never let us lower the fax machine." And she rang me up and told me this story, and it was this, wow, this happens. I'm going to meet those prejudices just because I'm disabled. That's terrible. But what it taught me was, as horrible as that rejection was, sometimes when doors close, and it sucks that they close so often for disabled people, and that is wrong, but sometimes when those doors close, they point you closer to the places that you should be and where the door is open and you can have the best impact and the best support and the people who are going to work with you. So you've got to sometimes balance it. Prejudice is wrong, and I'm not saying forgive it, but sometimes if you keep knocking, you will find a better place.
I just want to thank our questioner, Fiona, for inspiring such a wonderful, passionate discussion there. And let's move on. The next question's from Ben Payer-Smith.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ben. I'm about to say this. I have always been in a mainstream school, and I have learned a lot, but I still do not feel included. When so many of my friends have been excluded, why don't mainstream schools want to include my friends, with disability or without? Why do they keep telling us to go to a special school?
Yeah, I'll start with Catia. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for that question, Ben. I think this is a really important issue. I think we really need to talk about it. We're talking about the NDIS, but we need to talk about education and how that actually factors in to that big ambition that the NDIS has, which is to ensure that people with disability have full and equal rights in society and can participate. Now, my own experience, my son Julius is 8 years old and he's in year 3 at school. And when it was time for him to enrol in school, my husband and I went around and sort of saw the various principals of the state schools in our neighbourhood. And we got quite a few knockbacks, or a few, not explicit, but, yeah, don't know, yeah, no, there's a special school down the road and, special places for special people. Well, they didn't say that, but that was the message. And we were lucky. We, turned up at the school where he is now and, had a principal who was, sure, absolutely, let's do this. I don't exactly know how, but we're going to work with you and we're going to make sure that he has an inclusive education in this school. And that was really important. But I do, I talk to a lot of families and I know that when this happens, it's far too rare, and that children with disability, and particularly children with intellectual disability, are being constantly pushed out of the general education system. And that's absolutely not acceptable because, what does it take to get this system right? We've got a fundamental human right entrenched in a UN convention that we and 175 other countries have ratified and have committed to, which recognises that this is a right of every person with a disability. We've got close to 50 years of research showing the benefits of inclusive education, not just for kids with disabilities, but for everybody. Those benefits correlate with living independently, working in the open market, etc. So we've got a human right, we've got research, but we've got a lot of barriers being put in place and put in front of children with disability in terms of getting an education in a regular school with their siblings and with the kids in their street and in their neighbourhood. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do to fix this. And we can do it because we know that there are some great examples of inclusive schools in Australia. Not as many as we'd like to see, but we have that. And we know that there are examples of whole systems having moved to fully inclusive education for everybody. We've got New Brunswick in Canada. 5 years ago, they actually prohibited segregation of kids with disabilities in their schools. And then we've got Italy. Now, 40 years ago, this year, 2018 is the 40th anniversary of the closure of special schools in Italy. So there's a whole country out there that's been doing it for 40 years. Might not be perfect, but, they haven't returned back to segregated education. This is far too important. And, the vision of the NDIS is about participation. How can we build an inclusive society on the shoulders of an education system that pushes kids out to special separate schools? We can't, we really need to address this.
Dylan, do you want to come in?
Ben, thanks so much for your question, mate. I went to a mainstream school myself, and I think it's really important. I couldn't agree any more. In particular, when you leave school, you aren't as sheltered, you don't get as much help and things like that. And I think it's a great place to learn skills, but I think it's really important to as a snapshot of our community for everything to be inclusive as well, and it becomes like a workplace. If you aren't at an inclusive school and then you go try and get a job, if no one's had exposure to anybody with a disability, or you haven't worked with anybody, all of a sudden you're alienated straight away.
So where's the logic? Where's the logic in that? We train people with disabilities to be included in the community by segregating them in schools.
Exactly right. It's a backward step straight from the start, Ben, and I agree with you, mate, and it's a real shame that you do feel excluded. I mean, I went to a mainstream school and I got bullied about my disability and I felt excluded as well, and I think it's because of the misconceptions of what we can do, but also that existing prejudice that makes it hard. But stick at it, man, because trust me, you'll be killing it one day, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you one day.
We've got a gentleman with his hand up in the audience there. Keep it brief if you can. Go ahead.
Very quick comment. They say it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a nation to support people with disabilities. We need a whole-of-government response. We need a national strategy, not a document coming from one department trying to encourage others to get on board.
Thank you, sir. We will take that as a comment. Now, we received, yes, brief applause, we received an enormous number of questions from people struggling with the NDIS. We simply can't get to them all. Let's take a couple. The first is from Sarah Sidir.
Hi, I was just wondering, how are parents meant to navigate this new world of choice and control? How are they meant to understand all the ins and outs of plans and services and providers, the portal, when it works? They still need to advocate every single day to the extreme and go to work and do all the other things in their everyday lives. I know so many parents like myself who are just completely overwhelmed by this whole process.
And the next, before we go to the panel, the next, and they're on similar subjects, which is why we're doing it like this. The next is from Christina Ziaziaris.
My youngest son was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder level 2 just over a year ago when he was 4. This came as a huge relief as we felt we could start early intervention therapy to prepare for kindergarten. I'm a resilient person and I found this process completely overwhelming. We have only just received our first NDIS package for our son. Whilst we are thankful to be living in a country that offers financial assistance to help our son, the stress and frustration when dealing with the process and the wait to receive funding meant we had to move out of our family home and away from our community and support networks to make ends meet with out-of-pocket expenses. How can we improve the process?
Now, Bruce, in some degree you've forecast some of the answers here, so keep it brief, but you are hearing, and I kid you not, this is a tiny percentage of the questions from frustrated families tearing their hair out about dealing with the system. How can it be fixed quickly, not over 10 years?
Well, last year, spending on the NDIS was $850 million less than was forecast. This year, I anticipate actual spending will be between $1 billion and $1.5 billion under what is in the budget papers. Some of this money needs to be used to fix the system and fix it quickly. There is no excuse for the sort of staff caps we've got, the IT system we've got, the lack of Tier 2 support that we've got, and those things could be fixed extremely quickly. It's outside the control of the NDIA. I want to also support Graeme's comment about the NDIA and its staff. You know, 15% of them have a disability. When I was there, 50% had a lived experience of disability. So they are on your side just as much as they're on the side of everybody in this room. But the volume of work and the need for speed are such that we just need to invest in the capability that's needed, the training, and make it happen quickly. The IT system, if I just take that as one key point, that's not run by the NDIA, it's run by Centrelink. So,
well, yeah.
So the NDIA's ability to influence Centrelink is about as much as yours and mine.
That was a cost-saving measure, presumably. Are you saying that the NDIA needs its own computer system,
what I'm saying,
or high-tech version than
what I'm saying is that there needs to be an IT system that's built, that's fit for purpose. And it's interesting when the original Medibank scheme was introduced, it also had its IT problems, and at one point there were 500,000 claims that were that the new Medibank had not been able to process. But as a result of government commitment, it was fixed within 6 months. So these issues can be fixed, provided that the minister and the government directs Centrelink to fix the problem. So I believe these things can be fixed. They can be fixed quickly. It just needs to be done. There needs to be a political will for this to happen in a time frame that meets your and your family's objectives and all the other participants in the scheme who desperately need it.
Dylan, a short response on this one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, and there's so many, pitfalls on it, and I agree. I mean, when the NDIS came in, it sounds like everybody constantly complains around this situation, and it's such an incredible investment to get people what they need. I just want it to be rolled out in the right way. I can't believe the e-platform was built so poorly from the start, and to be honest, one of the big problems with it is part of it isn't even accessible. You know what I mean? It's for people with disabilities, and they're struggling to access it. I mean, it's got to be in from the beginning.
The overall takeout from this is let's not ruin the great concept of the National Disability Insurance Scheme by spending caps and spending under budget and bureaucracy. Let's actually deliver what was the great hope 4 or 5 years ago, and that's sort of what Bruce and Dylan and others are saying.
I would love to implore people, actually, because I think one of the things we can do is talk to each other. How did you do it? How did you make it work? What are you getting? Why are you getting that? So question and talk to one another. Cast off any sense of shame and literally just start talking. Also check out Every Australian Counts. They've got a great campaign to kick the NDIS into shape. That's what we've got to do. We've got to get together and go, OK, the NDIS is an awesome concept, but we must band together and get it to work. Disability can't be, something that is just on the shoulders of carers who are breaking their backs, or on disabled people who just decide not to go out and not live. And it can't be something that we put in the charity basket either. It's a human right that we're in your schools, that we're participating, that we go to your shops. And it will make this world and Australia so much better. But we have got to bandy together and make sure that we get the NDIS that we deserve. Yeah. So actually, how can we make it better? I say we fight.
Well, you're right, Kiruna.
Reframe, Graeme, because we're running out of time.
Good point. You're right, Kiruna. But the other thing that we need to do is we need to demand from our leaders on both sides of politics that the funding be locked in and safe and legislated, because we can't live like this.
Yes.
That is a message that's been resonating right from the beginning of the program, and I hope that a lot of these messages do resonate into the political sphere. The next question's from Oliver Bragg.
Hey everyone. When grandfather Peter Miles killed his wife, daughter and her 4 children before killing himself, the media reported the crime as horrific. When news came through that the 4 young children had autism, suddenly the reporting changed to be about how hard it had been for Peter Miles to care for them, as if murdering his grandchildren became less horrible because the victims had a disability. We label caring for children with autism as a burden. How has that now become a valid reason to justify murder?
Catia, I'll start with you because you're from WA and this story resonated most, well, it resonated across the country, obviously, but most profoundly in WA.
Yes, this is a terrible story, and you're right. Once the news broke, the linkage between the tragedy, the murder of this family, was very quickly linked to the fact that the children were autistic. Look, I'd like to say that I was surprised, but actually I wasn't. This is actually a really common pattern that happens when media reports on on domestic violence and domestic crimes against disabled people, where you know, disability is somehow portrayed as a causative factor. And I actually received a phone call at the time from a friend from Margaret River, who is autistic herself and the mum of autistic kids. And she was so stressed out about this. She said, look, the media have contacted me and I'm starting to see what's happening here and how this is unfolding, and I want to say something, but I'm too afraid to talk because I'm just worried about how they will take my words and what they'll spin it into. Now, this a couple of days ago, in the last few days, there was a really great report by ABC reporter Sarah Dingle on Radio National, and
Background Briefing.
On Background Briefing, yeah. And they actually looked at 15 years' worth of media reporting on these sorts of crimes, and these very common patterns emerge. About portraying, you know, people who commit these crimes as, you know, the devoted mother, you know, the burdensome disabled relative, etc. And unfortunately, this is also a pattern that we see in some of the media reporting in the US, and it's simply not appropriate. I mean, we don't actually report on domestic crime like that in relation to any other sort of context. So this is an issue of bias that is coming in. You know, it's sort of implicit bias about how we perceive these situations, and it's very much the lens of non-disabled perspectives on these sorts of situations. And I think one of the things that's very clear often in these reports is that you don't hear the voices of disabled people challenging these narratives and sort of, you know, pointing this out and challenging these ideas, which are actually very, very harmful. As a mum, as a parent, it horrifies me the way that this reporting continues to be done, and that the way that it reveals how we as a society think of disabled people.
Catia, you've summed that up rather well. I think we've got time for one last question. It is from a pair of disabled people, and we're going to go to that. It's a video from Jason and Katie in Williamstown in Victoria.
Hello, my name's Jason. This is Katie. We have been a couple for 3 years. We live in shared supported accommodation. We want to live out and live independently. Will the NDIS give us those options?
Start with Graeme.
Accommodation is an issue with the NDIS. There's just not enough housing available in Australia for people with disabilities. And I started, when I was at the Human Rights Commission with a number of others, the Livable Housing Australia initiative, and it was a non-legislative, non-regulated, voluntary commitment by industry to build more housing for people with disabilities. It has been an absolute failure, and we need to legislate to have a commitment to build appropriate accommodation for people with disabilities. And
Graeme, what about specifically this question about people with disabilities who want to form relationships with each other, because it seems to be almost prohibited in this case?
Well, see, Tony, I don't think that that people with disabilities wanting to form relationships should be any different to anyone else wanting to form relationships. And But one of the key issues is this accommodation, so we need to get that right. But we then need to recognise that the SDA, the Specialised Disability Accommodation rules, have come out recently, and my sense is that they push people away from living on their own in accommodation for people with disabilities and into more group homes and
Graeme, I'm going to stop you there, because we actually had an earlier question from Ben Payor-Smith. Ben, you had a question about what you want in terms of living, where you want to live. Your mum's sitting there too, so we'd quite like to hear from Sam, who we've heard for previously on the program. But so, one of you want to start us off?
You want me to go first?
Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
What we hear from the NDIS at the moment is that they won't fund overnight care for an individual with disability in their own home. So if Ben wants to move out, which I believe he does, and I can't wait. He may or may not need overnight support, but regardless, he should have the option to do that. That should be his right. He should not be forced into live in a group sharing situation if that's not what he wants to do. I'm not forced to live with other unknown adults. No. I don't believe his basic human rights should be violated like that either.
Yeah, let's hear from the rest of the panel then. Well, actually, Graeme, I need to hear from the others. So,
Sure.
Dylan.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, Ben. And Ben, I agree. I don't want to live with my mum either. You know what I mean? And no offence, Mum, do love you, Mum, wherever you are. But, you know, I think you should have the choice to be able to live wherever you want. And we talk about full inclusion. That's one of the basic rights of life, getting to choose where you live and how you live it. And you should deserve the funding. For too often, people have short arms and deep pockets and they're not paying for what you want. And you are voicing that to the people. And yeah, I couldn't agree anymore. I shouldn't be forced to live with anybody, neither should anybody else, that you don't want to live with. You should be given that ability to make that choice for yourself so you can get out there and live an independent and, most importantly, normal and regular life, just like everybody else.
Kiruna.
I think accessible housing is a huge issue. I mean, I remember when I moved out for the first time, one of the biggest challenges for me was finding a landlord who'd go, yeah, OK, I'll let you lower the front door lock so that I could open the door and get in and out. So, you know, we really need to change that marketplace. I know housing in Australia actually is a problem for everybody. I mean, you know, a millennial is barely going to be able to afford their own home anyway, but add on top of that physical or cognitive barriers or things that might need support, and you realise, wow, the housing crisis, it's huge, and we're not even supplying appropriate social housing. You know, I think that we need to address this.
Let me go to Bruce. And can the NDIS address everything? Housing is one of the issues, but there'll be some people out there saying, oh, we can't afford to do absolutely everything, and there'll be others saying we can't afford not to.
So, Tony, there are three issues here. There's the point that Graeme made, which is that 10 years ago there was an ambition that in 2020 every dwelling in Australia would be accessible. Yeah. We are 100 miles from
2020?
By 2000.
That's like soon, mate.
Yeah, that's right.
18 months.
That's right.
That's right.
So on that was the aspirational target that the Property Council of Australia signed up to.
I love the positivity. I love the...
I like the use of the word aspiration.
Aspiration.
Yes. But if just 50% of that were being done, that would be 100,000 dwellings a year that would be accessible. It hasn't worked, as Graeme has pointed out. The second issue is that when it comes to social housing, the stock is actually declining. Yeah. So it's not standing still, it's declining. So as a proportion of total housing, it's falling even faster.
But these are not NDIA issues.
No, these are not NDIA, but this is the environment in which something like 140,000 people under the NDIS are going to be looking for housing.
That's right.
OK, I'm going to have to stop you there because we're over time, and I just want to give Catia the final word here, because once again you'll be looking at Julius some years down the track, but trying to find a place to live.
Yeah, look, and I think Julius will probably have very similar aspirations to Ben and all of us, actually. I expect that he won't want to live with me at some point, and he'll want to find himself someone and
possibly, as in the other, remember the video question, wanting to form a relationship and finding that impossible.
Absolutely. I think that's really important. Yeah. I think one thing that I'd say in relation to this is that I think just in the last few days, Canada introduced national legislation for accessibility, and we don't have that. We have, you know, a bit of a hodgepodge of voluntary, you know, standards, etc., etc. I think we really need to go down that path, because accessibility in all areas of life is really fundamental to this. And again, it's something that ties in with the NDIS. You need to be able to move around your environment and to do things in order to actually achieve the ambition that lays behind this scheme. So that's a really important thing. But no, Ben, I really hope that things turn out, and I'll come and visit you sometime.
I'll come over for a beer. Yeah, I'll come over for a beer, Benny.
I think Ben's pleased to hear that. It's a second appearance on Q&A. We had him in South Australia a little while back. That is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Graeme Innes, Catia Malaquias, Dylan Alcott, Kiruna Stamell and Bruce Bonyhady. Thank you very much. Now, you can continue the discussion with Q&A Extra on News Radio and Facebook Live, where Tracy Holmes will be joined by Graeme Innes very soon. He'll be racing over to that studio. Next Monday night, I'll be on leave. Hamish McDonald will be hosting Q&A in Melbourne with the Liberal member for Corangamite, Sarah Henderson, the Shadow Health Minister, Catherine King, the founder of the Australian Conservatives Party, Bruce Bonyhady, the editor of the Saturday paper, Eric Jensen, and comedian Corey White, whose series Roadmap to Paradise has been tackling the big issues with surprising solutions. Now, this year marks the 10th anniversary of Q&A. Next week, we'll announce the results of our Q&A People's Panel. We've been sorting through your auditions, and in 2 weeks' time, we'll bring that special Q&A anniversary People's Panel to you. I'll see you then. We'll leave you tonight with a taste of those 10 years.
Australian people make up their own mind.
Self-doubt equals weakness.
To give dignity and respect to people.
I did exactly what I promised at the election.
There's an app called Grindr. I'll put it on your phone.
Are you Muslim?
Don't call me a problem.
That the church will never marry me.
Believes in empirical evidence, quoting consensus.
I brought the graph, right? I mean, I haven't mowed the lawn for a long time.
That we can only really live the good life by sharing in a common life.
As long as you're not poor or ugly or sick.
Deal with white people who speak English.
On another planet that has 2 legs, 2 arms. We know what you're all. We rise up, we rise up, we rise.
Our government is going to deport a 10-year-old boy.
If you lift my tax-free threshold, that changes my life.
I have not been able to secure my NDIS funding.
Calling it elitist, boring and costly.
I don't know what you're on about, darling.
Thanks, y'all.